Ladies and gentlemen, may we ask you to take your seats for the final panel of the 2019 Körber History Forum. And this announcement is not fake news. So this is the last panel. We are starting now on the power of manipulation and on the question of how to deal with propaganda and so-called fake news in past and present. And what we are of course most interested in from this panel is answers to the question of whether fake news, whether propaganda is anything new, and if not, when it emerged and under which conditions, and how democracy, our democracies we are living in, can actually, what they actually can do to counter fake news. So, 4 distinguished panelists, one also very distinguished moderator. We start with Anne Applebaum, historian at the London School of Economics at the moment, professor of practice at the London School of Economics. Then we have Jo Fox with us, who just told me that she has been working on propaganda for quite some years and is quite surprised that it has become fashionable now again. Then Jason Stanley, philosopher, linguist from Yale University in the US, and last but not least Markus Engels, the executive director or the director of the Global Solutions Initiative here in Berlin. And the panel will be moderated by Nathalie Nogueret, member of the, how do you say that, editorial board and columnist at The Guardian in London. So, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Jo here. Wait a minute. Yeah, okay. Excellent. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is the last panel, but the best panel. And I'm delighted to be here. I've been a journalist for almost 30 years. I must not faint. I got into the profession thinking, well, you know, it's all about just, you know, establishing the facts, going out there. People will read it. You know, I can contribute to changing the world, building awareness. You know, 30 years on, anybody who's in journalism knows that it's not that simple at all to wage that, to have that mission and to hope for that impact. We are drowning, a lot of us, drowning in an ocean of junk information. You know, our societies are drowning in junk information. And I think we need to think about it as junk content online, just like we worry about junk food, you know, poisoning our bodies and damaging our health. We have societies, we have to think about junk content online as a threat. And so the panel we have today is titled The Power of Manipulation on Dealing with Propaganda and Fake News in the Past and Present. So because this is a history forum, we will be thinking about the past and the lessons we can draw from what happened in the past. So we have 3 historians, as you heard, and we have Markus, who is not a historian, he's a jurist by training. He studied law.
I'm a philosopher.
You're a philosopher, sorry, okay. There I go with false information, okay. And Markus is a practitioner of politics, so it'll be interesting to have his point of view on all the questions we're going to bring up. I thought we're going to be talking on the stage for roughly under an hour, and then we'll have questions and answers from the audience. But if somebody is absolutely, you know, dying to ask a question as we go along, just raise your hand. We'll keep this, you know, conversational. And I thought we'd build it in three moments. The first one, and I'm going to be going to each of the panelists for like a 1 or 2 minute answer. The first question will be, you know, as we look at the problems of manipulation, disinformation, propaganda, what's old and what's really new, you know, what is old and what is new. Then we're going to look at how propaganda, disinformation affects societies. We'll think about that, also looking at the past, but today, how it affects societies, how it affects individuals, all of us. And then we're going to be very constructive and positive, and we're going to give you some, you know, good vibes to leave the room with. We're going to think about solutions, and we're going to hear about solutions. What to do today, again, drawing on the past. So, Joe, I wanted to kick it off with you. You've looked at the interwar period in Europe and propaganda, psychological warfare, both, tell me if I'm wrong, both on the side of dictatorships and on the side of democracies. So when I ask you the question, what's new, what's old, what's new, what would you say?
Well, I think that propaganda technique in its basic form is quite static. And I think that's because it's embedded within human psychology. That's what it works within. That's its point of reference. But because it's applied to rapidly changing circumstances, it's always perceived to being in flux. So if you were to ask the commentators of the interwar period, are you dealing with something new? They would say absolutely. And that's been true of every point of evolution of propaganda's history. But I think we are experiencing something new here, and that is in terms of speed, scope, and scale of propaganda. Who the propagandist is has changed, and who controls the infosphere, that has changed. And we're also dealing for the first time with computational propaganda. That is propaganda that is generated by and propelled by algorithm. That is a new technology. Now, of course, we've experienced technological change throughout the whole of the 20th century and into the 21st. But what we have here is, I think, something quite different.
Mm-hmm. Marcus, I'm coming to you on this question of what's old, what's new. You were involved in a political campaign, the campaign of Martin Schulz. You look at politics, society. Have you, in your experience, felt that you became, or your efforts were the victims, or you suffered from disinformation, propaganda, and how would you say, from that experience, the old isn't, the new is not so new, or looking at what you know about the past, what would you say about what is old, what is new, directly from your experience in politics?
I mean, can you hear me? Yes. Obviously, what's old is there was always propaganda, there was always lies, there were always rumors, that always exists. But what is new definitely is, and Mrs. Fox already mentioned that, is technology. There is new technology, and that is speeding up communication, and especially when you think about communication, the relation between senders and recipients is changing. I mean, in the old days, we all were watching television, were reading newspapers, were reading books, sitting together in the pub and changing the world there. But now everybody is a sender and can communicate through the world. And the question, but we will come to solutions later, do we need new rules, or do we need rules for this new world? So that has to definitely change. And there is a second element, which I think is very, very important. To make fake news work, to make the whole populist propaganda work, you need to have doubts on institutions. I mean, you see that when you have, me being a German, sorry for that, but I mean, when there is a scandal or whatever, or a tragedy, people tend to go to the old traditional Tagesschau, for example, because there is a sort of gut feeling that they are not producing fake news. So the precondition,
the evening TV news.
Yeah. That the precondition that fake news work, as well that populist work, is that you really start questioning institutions, government, media, civil society, And I have to say, me as being General Secretary of the Global Solutions, dealing in a way with the whole world, with the entire world, all populists around the world really were quite successful in saying these bloody elites, these lying media, this is all wrong, this is all fake news. And that was, from my point of view, the precondition, and that is new in a way. I'm not an historian, but that is new, and that is the precondition or the reason why fake news and populists are so successful, from my point of view.
And what is your take?
Of course, propaganda is as old as politics. I mean, there's no, maybe even older. There's no, for all we know, those cave paintings, that they're meant to, lie about how many horses there are outside. I don't know, but or mammoths. I do think we should take a step back and understand that what we're living through now is really a profound political change and a profound economic and societal change. We're living through an information revolution whose closest, the closest comparison you can find is the invention of the printing press, when you had a fundamental shift in power from monasteries to a range of others in society. It brought many wonderful good things. I think we're all probably here in favor of books. It also led to 100 years of religious warfare, and a third of the inhabitants of Europe died. So, this is that kind of transition. All of social life, all of political life, all of intellectual life is being read and absorbed in new ways. The iPhone was invented in 2007, which is not very long ago, and yet, a vast majority of us now get all of our information, our political information, our cultural information, from a little computer, a little telephone, in some form that we carry around in their pockets. And that has simply changed our relationship to power. Secondly, all of us are now creators of information. We are all now publishers. We are all now editors. We are all now journalists. And the specialness of journalists, whatever that was, for better or for worse, is gone. It's not coming back. The authority that newspapers and broadcasters once had has disappeared. And this growth and lack of trust that you've just pointed out is partly coming from that. Now that we're all producers and consumers of information, there's no particular reason why we should trust, El País or the New York Times or Der Spiegel more than anybody else. The other piece of this that is very new and different is that the information world and network that we now live in is global. So anybody can now interfere in anybody else's conversation. In other words, what used to be a national German conversation, Germans speaking German to one another on German TV, in German newspapers, I suppose it used to be possible, I don't know if you were Russian or Chinese or American, to enter that conversation even in a real form or a fake form, but you would have very small impact. And if you look at, for example, Soviet attempts to do disinformation from the past, for example, the 1970s and 80s, these were almost always involved planted newspaper articles, and then there was a long attempt to get those newspaper articles picked up by other people and to sort of eventually, after a year or two, push them into the mainstream press. And this was how you got, for example, there's a famous rumor that the CIA invented AIDS, okay? This was a Soviet rumor that was planted in different places, in India and Italy and a couple of other, with the idea that it would then get, okay, this kind of process can now take place in 10 minutes. Anybody is now part of anybody's conversation. So if you want, it's the kind of dark side of globalization. The Russians can take part in the American elections, the Chinese can take part in the Bolivian elections, the Bolivians can take part in the in the Taiwanese elections, it doesn't matter. It is a global conversation, and anybody can be part of it, and anybody can attempt to do any kind of propaganda in part of it. In other words, the globalization of it has also been a kind of fundamental shift. I'll stop there.
Thanks.
So I guess it's my responsibility to push the old part.
I want to say you wrote a book titled How Propaganda Works. So, what's new?
Right. So I think the previous panel was on colonialism. but I prefer to think of it as fake news panel 1 and us as fake news panel 2. Because that panel was all about propaganda and fake news. It was about fake history, the invention of history, and indeed, when you look at the current moment, when you look at Brexit, when you look at what's happening in the United States and in Russia, you see this thing you see this colonial thing. We had an empire, we lost it. And that's a central feature. That feature that was explored so excellently by Professor Achebe and others in the previous session is what prepares people for propaganda. They've been trained in all these countries. I remember I was in Budapest in 2009, 2010, and if I ever hear the word Trianon again, I will be sick. Everywhere is talking about their loss of their great empires. We talked in the last panel about how colonialism is so destructive on the countries that are subject to it, but we can't forget the master-slave dialectic, that colonialism also deeply destroys the countries that perpetrate it and comes back to haunt them. As Césaire tells us, you do it first over there and then it comes back to your host countries. And I think we're seeing that. Now, as far as we need to explain why empire plays such a central role everywhere in these far-right parties. I prefer to call them far-right rather than populist because I think that's more focused on the problem. One thing, I think if we divide the problem, so there's a new thing that politicians everywhere are breaking democratic norms. They're describing immigrants as invaders. My president describes immigrants as snakes he reads the snake poem. But that's connected to the technology point that Anne is talking about, because what frees people in this way to speak in such horrific ways about their fellow human beings? Well, you've got these anonymous chat rooms where people can get together and spread poison. And so that's a way in which the technology links with the failure of democratic norms.
I wanted to just reflect for a minute on the expression fake news. I'm personally not always very comfortable with it. I don't know what you think about it. Okay, nobody likes the expression
Nobody
fake
likes
news. Okay. In one sentence, why do you not like it?
Because it's just not helpful. What we need to do is understand a very complex phenomenon. And by having it just under this unhelpful umbrella, we don't get to the heart of what propaganda is. I mean, what is the difference, for example, between explicit, overt propaganda and disinformation? These are different. We need to understand the differences.
Yeah. I would also say, what we're really talking about is different levels of fakery in the conversation. There's whether fake accounts, so people pretending to be somebody else online. There's a second level, which is fake amplification, so an attempt to amplify stories in a way that's artificial, using bots or trolls. The third level is actually false stories, which is not, and the fourth level, which is I think what you mean by disinformation, is false narratives. So organized attempts to create false impressions of a story, using all three of those other methods plus more. And so what we really mean are campaigns to create impressions or views or opinions, and not just a single story that isn't true.
Right. We could even call them propaganda campaigns. Right. It's not fake news that immigrant did that horrible crime. It's perfectly true. I'm a philosopher. I go with the literal use of true and false. So it's true that immigrant committed that horrible crime, but it's still propaganda. It's used, you can also say that blue-eyed person, German, committed a horrible crime, but, so there's perfectly true elements, and the word fake news is just it's fake news that it's new.
Do you like the expression?
I would like to add another level, and that is perception. I remember me being for the first time in China, that must be 20, 25 years ago. And I went into that little shop and I bought a map of the world. And I had it in my suitcase, went back home. And when I was back home and I was sitting together with friends and saying, I was in China, it was brilliant. And they said, you brought something. I said, yeah, I bought a map of the world. And we put it out and everybody said, oh, that's completely wrong. because China was in the middle of the world. And of course, all my friends, I mean, I learned that Europe is the middle of the world and it's much bigger. I mean, check, and for the first time, I have to say, it's embarrassing for me, but for the first time, I learned that obviously the perception where the center of the world is and how big you are and how great and how powerful is differing. Yeah. And that is obviously not a fake news, so it's perception, but it's very important because you just said the internationalization of the communication is important, and that is a challenge for all of us, because within seconds I'm confronted with somebody who really perceives the world completely, entirely different. For example, thinking that he's the center of the world. Well, I'm the center of the world, you know? And that sounds funny, but it's obviously not, because it's questioning all our values, our ideas of normality, what is normal. And that is a great challenge as well. So I would like to add to the 4 levels, a 5th level as well.
That was also the subject of the colonialism panel, that point. Who's the center of things?
Absolutely. I wanted to just mention last month, I wanted to throw this into the conversation. Last month, there's a big data and artificial intelligence company that carried out a survey in several European countries. The company is called Alto Analytics. You'll find articles in The Guardian and Politico.eu on this. The European countries were Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Poland. What they found, this study was carried out earlier this year, they found, and it was all about the content that is online and on the big platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and others. And they found that 0.1% of users on these platforms generate about 10% of the content, right? So that's a ratio of 1 to 100. And a lot of these users, the ones they were monitoring, were indeed tied to far-right networks. Yep. So the amplification phenomenon is monitored right there. And a lot of them, not all, but some of them were automated bots, right? Not all human beings. And this comes out just as we are a few days ahead of the EU elections. And I mean, on the basis of that, I welcome any comment on this, but on the basis that I wanted to, when we say fake news, and you've all commented on the expression, we don't speak enough perhaps about the intent behind it, right? And that matters. Yeah. The design, that matters immensely. What is the source and what is the intent? And we probably should worry about deliberate disinformation campaigns, right? Like absolutely deliberate, thought through, and aiming at a particular goal that hits our societies and us as individuals, changes the way we see the world and people around us. I wanted to ask all of you, from your research, your experience, how would you say propaganda affects our societies, looking at the past, how it affected them in the past, how it affects societies and individuals? What would you say is the impact on societies and individuals?
I mean, in general terms, I think what's quite interesting about the broader effect, what it shows is that it can drill down into pre-existing beliefs. This is how it fundamentally works. And some of the really interesting debates about the 20s and 30s took as the starting point propaganda's absolute efficacy, that it was always successful. Right. There's always these terms about hypodermic needle, magic bullet, silver bullet, all of that is absolutely rife. And certainly commentators in the 20s and 30s exaggerated the effect of propaganda. So we've got to be careful now, as we have these debates, not to do precisely the same thing. Such was that experience that all of these different organizations sprang up all over the world trying to make a science of propaganda. Right. If we understand it, we can inoculate ourselves against it. I was just in the New York Public Library looking at the papers of the IPA. IPA, which was the Institute of Propaganda
Propaganda Analysis,
Analysis,
well.
started in 1937, and they were set up to help the American people see and identify propaganda, to the extent that they produced a little card with 7 attributes of propaganda that you could whip out of your wallet, and that's that kind of propaganda. Great, I can identify it as such. They folded by 1942. Why? Because that kind of science, propaganda does not fit into these boxes. And it moves, and it can morph, and it can change, and it takes different
Wait for my
forms.
new book.
Okay. But you know,
You're going to fix the problem.
I think the crucial thing here is just not to take as the starting point its universal success.
Yes, also, just can I add a historical anecdote for you? I wrote a book about the Sovietization of Eastern Europe after the war.
Iron Curtain.
And in the course of doing that, I did some work in East Berlin, actually it was in Potsdam, in the archives of what had been East German radio. And I read through the conversations that the people who ran the radio station, and this is 1947, 1948, 1949, the people who ran the radio station were having with one another. And this is when they were already putting out this kind of Stalinist era East German propaganda. And a lot of the conversations are about, why isn't our propaganda working? Why don't people believe us? And they would have these conversations, and it's all on recording, but it's because, and it's because we're not trying hard enough. We need to be more expressive. And then somebody would pipe up and say, well, maybe it's because the 5-year plan isn't successful. And everybody would say, no, that can't be the reason. It has to be because our propaganda is not good enough. And it's true that the communist states had this idea that you could successfully transform society through education and propaganda. If you just put up enough posters, you taught people the right history, you could change the human brain. And that, as we know, did not succeed. So it's a nice lesson to remember.
A couple points. I'm in some sense the descendant of the general semantics program, because I'm a philosopher of language working on propaganda, and so Kotarbiński, there was a Polish tradition of using logic and semantics against propaganda, and rhetoric. It is true that the rhetorical form of statements makes an effect on people's preferences. So, for example, here's an example from the marketing literature. If you ask, if you take 2 groups of people, you say to them, the control group isn't asked a hypothetical question. The subjects are told, here's a completely hypothetical question. If you were to learn that chocolate cake were just as healthy as salad, would it make you eat more chocolate cake? And they all say, no. And then they go to a second room, and they're told to take a snack, and there's chocolate cake and salad. And the people who have been asked a hypothetical question, the control group, 25% take the chocolate cake. People who've been asked a hypothetical question, 44% take the chocolate cake. And if you ask them to think hard about the hypothetical question, over 60% take the chocolate cake. So, and then they all report that the hypothetical question had no effect whatsoever on their choice. So those are, and if you think about George Bush's campaign in 2000, when they had a push poll, when McCain was leading in South Carolina, if you were to find out that John McCain had an illegitimate black child, would that make you more or less likely to vote for John McCain? You can see that rhetoric does have some effect. But it has a kind of temporary, unnoticed effect. And I think real propaganda, it requires pre-existing ideology. And the question of propaganda studies is you have to have the pre-existing ideology there, or else the propaganda won't be effective. And the question that I look at, and I think a lot of us look at, is how does the propaganda interact with the pre-existing ideology to protect it from reason and strengthen it?
Marcus, on the campaign trails in politics, what have you observed as the concrete impact on people of propaganda, disinformation?
Does it work? Yeah. I think very fundamentally, populists have understood social media much better than the other side. I have as everybody, some Facebook friends, I don't know, couple of hundreds. And I guess these people are more from the progressive side. And let's say this evening I will go to Facebook and just have a look what's happening. And I'm sure, and you are sure as well, that 80% of my Facebook friends will share stuff by the populist and saying, oh, can you imagine that? They are doing this posting on, and isn't it horrible and isn't it inhuman? And they obviously don't understand that they support the populist by their actions. They don't understand that. And when I read that Donald Trump is irrational and everybody is blaming him, and all news in Europe, especially in Europe, are full on how crazy and stupid and dumb he is. And what people don't understand, he is rational. He is obviously serving for his people. So the division of society, again, is a precondition of populist success. And what the tolerant or the progressive side of the world obviously don't understand how these mechanisms work. And that is my experience, that we, as I guess that we are the tolerant ones, we're always giving a lot of noise to these populists. And that seems to be one part of the problem. Or not?
No, I was just going to say there's study after study has shown that really what lies at the base of the problem is actually polarization. And almost all disinformation campaigns work better on highly polarized and distrustful audiences. And they keep, this effect keeps being shown in conspiracy theories work much better because when you have audiences of people who are very distrustful of other institutions and only trust the people who are already inside their cell, then it's much easier to spread rumors in that audience.
So I'm going to register a disagreement with some. Both days, people have been using words, and actually you raised this, these words, populist. Now we've got polarization, tribalism is another one. I don't like these terms. I want to be polarized in a group that thinks that the earth is round. That's a great group to be polarized in. I want to be polarized in a group that believes in evolution. So I'm very skeptical that polarization, but more generally, this neutral use of terms like propaganda, misinformation without thinking about their intent, it's meant to make us seem bipartisan. It's meant to make us seem neutral as to political positions. But it's pretty clear to me, that there are different problems in the world. One problem is the kind of Venezuelan kleptocracy. That's a problem. But another kind of problem is the global far right that is a very particular structure that, Anne, you've described in your work, that I describe in my work. I call it fascist politics. And it's a very particular structure. You had an empire, there's a chosen race, women have a particular place. And when we use terms like populist, when we use terms like tribal or polarized, it makes us look away from this common structure.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that it's quite striking that this debate precisely mirrors the debate that we would have been having in 1930. The idea that somehow propaganda is a morally dubious exercise, of course, comes out of the debates in the interwar period about the propaganda of the First World War, the rise of the dictatorship stealing a lead in propaganda, and the progressives and the Liberal Democrats wringing their hands. Well, what do we do about this? Because on the one hand, doesn't propaganda fly in the face of democracy? In fact, the second Minister of Information during the war years in Britain, Sir John Reith, denounced propaganda as an exotic. It has to be grafted onto the democratic machinery. He said this was the Minister of Propaganda. That is a very clever propaganda strategy in and of its own right, by the way, because it legitimizes your own activities. And on the other hand, you have the progressives, people like John Grierson, saying, listen, the democratic idea is powerful, and we have to fight fire with fire. We have to have our own equally persuasive, equally loud, equally dramatic propaganda. That's effectively what we're dealing with here, all set within that context of polarized politics.
I want to go back to one thing you said earlier, which is in the interwar period, there was an exaggeration of people in democracies exaggerate it. That's an interesting thought. And I want to be slightly counterintuitive perhaps here, because I'm wondering, are we, although we are looking at a real troubling phenomenon, are we also perhaps exaggerating it? Are we in danger of exaggerating it? And I mean, in media organizations, we know that there has been what we call the Trump bump and the Brexit bump, right? We've in a way, or some of our legacy media organizations have benefited from this fear and panic, literally, in the face of political developments and the spread of disinformation. And so, in a way, I mean, I don't want to sound cynical, but in a way, we have an interest in, making sure that people are absolutely aware of this disinformation. We in a way, but are we sizing it up in a precise enough way which would help address the problem? And what would you say? I think you probably disagree with me there.
No, I just think it's important to see it as part of something bigger. This isn't just about, I don't know, some Russians creating fake Facebook pages in the US election. This is a transformation in the way all of us get and receive information. And there are good things about it and there are bad things about it. But we need to understand that that it will change the way in which we see things. I mean, you've already spoken about algorithms. I'll hope you say some more. I hope you'll say a few more things. I mean, but I mean, just to be very crude and brief about it, I mean, we know, for example, that the way Facebook works is that the algorithm is designed so that you spend as much time as possible on Facebook. And one of the ways in which it assures that is that it feeds you more of what it thinks you want to see, first of all, and also that it feeds you emotional and exciting and sensational sometimes information. So we know that the natural temptation anyway of human beings is to spread salacious gossip and look for sensation. We know this is now built into the algorithm and it's favoring that kind of news. Okay, so that's not a Russian disinformation campaign that we're talking about, but it is a change in the way that people are reading and hearing about politics, on their cell phones, flicking through, the news on, celebrities and on movie stars and on politicians, and it all begins to seem interchangeable. So this whole transformation is something that I do think is really profound and really serious, and understanding what it is and what it means for politics is pretty central.
Joe, tell us why it was exaggerated in the interwar period and what parallels you see with today.
It's all about, the whole debates in the 20s and 30s were all about the malleability of the masses. Right. Almost from whatever you read, really, in the 20s and 30s, it started from the basic assumption that the masses, not the elites, of course, never susceptible to propaganda. But the masses were malleable.
This is what the communists thought too.
Yeah, that
Bolsheviks.
You could craft and shape them in whatever way you see fit if you had the right form of communication. And there was a concern that with the explosion of the mass media in the 20s, could the masses pick their way through this huge amount of information? You needed a technocratic elite to make sense of it for them. But that they were vulnerable, that they were malleable, is not questioned in any literature from left to right, scientific, literary, whatever. Now, when you look at the practice of propaganda, how does it work? It works in dialogue with those people, and it works within their pre-existing beliefs. There's very little you can do to flip someone totally overnight. If you craft and work within a set of pre-existing beliefs. So, I mean, Goebbels was very good at this because he saw that relationship with the people, this sort of what he described as a living contact. It is ultimately some form of dialogue. And that's why I say
it adapts, right?
It adapts and it changes, and you can tweak and morph and change and shape and crystallize and sharpen, but flip.
Right. So we have to think, so the question of the efficacy of propaganda is the question of how much is pre-existing beliefs and how much is propaganda. I mean, American president wins an election by appeal to racism should not be like, wow, the world has changed. That's how American presidents win elections. So to put together, I mean, I think you can provide an explanation of the American election, not to disagree with my dear colleague Tim Snyder, but without much help from Russia. Marcus talked about, elites, the idea that elites are suspicious and have failed and the system is corrupt. There's a study by Ezra Zuckerman from MIT called The Authentic Appeal of the Lying Demagogue, where he shows there's two cases. One case, people see a fair game, and the fair game is, and there's a player who lies, and everyone's like, oh, that person is not authentic, they're dishonest. And the other one, it's clearly a cheating game, and it's not a fair game, it's rigged, and everyone thinks the person who's openly lying and cheating is the authentic person. So but the elites did a very good job of delegitimizing themselves with the Iraq War, if you want to talk about fake news. And then you got someone who broke democratic norms, who stood up and said all these things that you weren't allowed to say, so it was shocking. They broke the rules. And people were like, wow, that person's cool. So,
Marcus, would you like to come in?
I would just add to the point of the dialogue, because I think this is true, that there is a dialogue. And the question for me is, obviously everybody in the world is affected by globalization. And there is a sort of, how should I put that, a liberal answer what globalization means. And the first liberal answer is globalization is good for you. Because globalization means growth, and growth means jobs, and jobs means wealth for all of us. That is one answer. And there was a second answer in the globalization saying, I mentioned the Washington Consensus. Government, state is evil, privatization is better, and that is good for you. And the government and the state is not a good entrepreneur. And the truth is, people now witness that this is not true. In the Rust Belt of the United States, they don't see globalization as a success. And they say, now, everybody, all the liberals are telling me globalization is good, you have to believe it. That's the main narrative. And there, from the perspective of the Global Solutions Initiative, which I represent, we think tackling populists, sorry for using the word again, tackling populists needs to have a new narrative. And the success of the populists is they have a narrative. They say, all right, globalization is evil, and we build borders, we build fences, and that's fine. Then we can keep the world, the good old world as it was. And that is a very powerful narrative, which obviously works around the world, back to nationalism. And the so-called liberal answer, no, it's wrong, globalization is good. This is proved to be wrong from my point of view, and therefore we propose to have a new narrative on what we call recoupling on economic and social process that has to bring together as a fundamental paradigm change and tackling the nationalism and that narrative.
I just have to quickly disagree about, I don't think AfD support in Bavaria comes from poor people who are suffering from globalization. I think AfD support in Bavaria comes from former Nazi areas and in the United States, black Americans were most hurt by the financial crisis, but they didn't rush into the arms of far-right leaders.
Marcus, do you want to answer that on Bavaria?
I'm not saying this is just about rich against poor. That would be a little bit too simplistic. But there is a main narrative, and that says globalization is good, and that is not the experience of many people. And that was what I meant by in the Rust Belt, people feel like that globalization is not good. That globalization means lose of job, means a lot of challenges, and therefore just repeating constantly from the liberal progressive side, you have to believe it's good for you, is, from my point of view, a wrong path.
And that question of belief and perception is important. I mean, you've written about how a society where people feel that things are unjust is fertile ground for
Yeah, because-
propaganda to take root.
Yeah, because if you, I mean, Du Bois talks about the psychological wages of whiteness in the United States. Whenever, there's a chapter in his book, Black Reconstruction, A Poor White, and then we talk about the poor whites, but because you had this racial hierarchy, it led people to fall into the arms of the far-right propaganda, because you have colonial myths in the UK. You have people thinking that the European Union invaded a once great empire.
Okay, so we're gonna was this me? Sorry. No, it wasn't me. We're going to move in a minute on to the solutions, the good news, the good positive stuff. But before we do that, I wanted to just take stock and ask you how bad you think things are, how bad you think things are right now. And I wanted to read you this, famous quote by Hannah Arendt. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the dedicated communist, but people for whom distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists. So the question is, without wanting to over-dramatize, are we slowly inching towards a world where, for many people, distinction between fact and false, truth and fiction is no longer, the distinction is no longer there? What would you like, from your historical research, from your experience, Marcus, what would you say? And we'll move down.
I would say yes.
You would say we're already in that world.
No, we're in a world where
Sorry.
the whole conversation about free speech that we have had for 200 years doesn't really make sense anymore, because people are now overwhelmed with information. It's not a question of, everybody has this George Orwell model that there's a guy in a room in an institution and his job is to cut articles out of the newspaper, and that's what censorship is to prevent you from seeing something. Now we have exactly the opposite thing happening. So if, for example, the Russian government wants to affect the perception of an incident, they don't cut it out of the news. They flood the news zone with millions of false or even half-true insinuations and articles. This is, for example, what happened when the plane was shot down, the Malaysian airline was shot down over eastern Ukraine. There were 300 different versions of events put out, dozens of explanations, millions and so people were overwhelmed by information and said, well, we can't possibly decide what's true, how can we ever know? And this is a new problem, and this feeling of not being able to tell what's true and what's false, because anyway, it's all on my phone, and I have no idea what's real. That's my view.
Do you think, Marcus, are we in that world where the difference between true and false is no longer in people's minds?
I'm not known as a sort of postmodernism, everything is all right, everything is cool. No, but I think what we really need to do to come to the positive end of the debate, the first thing is what I said at the beginning. I think it's really crucial to defend institutions. We need to have everybody, because how should I know all these things around me? And I need to have institutions, especially media institutions, where I can really double check things. That is really important. And the second thing is, I think, is as relevant as well. And that is, of course, we need an education for a globalized world. And that means, what I meant by perception, we are all confronted with different perspectives. And that needs to learn that, I don't know, I'm not a scientist as all of you, but that 90% of everything is gray. It is not black and white. There is different perspective, and we have to learn that this is real as well. And I mean, in all my jobs, I had to travel a lot. When you go to Russia, when you go to the Near East, when you go to Washington, when you go to China, no matter what you're talking about, they have a different perspective, and it is not wrong. It is not wrong, it's different, and that's what we have to learn for the 21st century.
So just to 100% back that up, and I'm a university professor, and I'm a university professor, and there's an attack on the universities now. And one way the attack on the universities takes place, it's very nefarious. It says the universities teach that there's no one truth, that there are different perspectives. It's postmodernism. Now, here's something about history. One period in history is experienced differently by different groups. Black Americans, have experienced 1860 or 1850 very differently than white Americans. Women have experienced all of history differently than, one period of history is experienced differently by different groups. That's not postmodernism, that's fact. And when they attacked university, so they're constantly saying gender ideology and gender studies and post-colonial studies are postmodern, but it's the opposite. Those are disciplines rooted in factual truth, trying to tell you about the different perspectives. And often when they mean, well, there's one truth, they mean, oh, you just should tell the great book story, that it's Shakespeare, that it's, when our English department at Yale tried to add Ngugi wa Thiong'o to the required readings list, not getting rid of Shakespeare, they got so much hate mail and right-wing attacks. So that's the structure of the attack on truth. That's one part.
This genuinely worries me, actually, from a historian's perspective, is this attack on the validity of scientific fact, by which I mean the facts that are known to us now on the basis of research and legitimate evidence. And when we're in a situation, this is the antidote to some of the propaganda in the 20s and 30s. One could pull on facts. And what is very important is to have that distinction between fact and opinion, and to clearly label them as such. When you have government ministers in Britain denouncing expertise as being useless to society, when you have the dismissal by mainstream politicians of uncomfortable truths as fake news and false news and post-truth, this is where we get into some very dangerous territory. And I think it's really very important to reassert expertise and the importance of it in order to counter some of these propagandistic activities.
One thing about all these far-right parties is they're all, they all deny climate change.
Climate change
What's that about?
This is really very serious. When we look at where that is happening, climate change is one area, and the other is, interestingly, vaccination.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we can now begin to see the consequences of some of that activity. So there are very real consequences to some of this stuff.
But this gets to the intent point.
Yes. We're going to, thanks for those thoughts. We're going to, okay, I'm going to ask you what the solutions are. And I'm kicking off with you. What do you see? You at LSE, you run an initiative called ARENA, which aims to combat disinformation. But tell us what your thoughts are today on what we need to do, basically what we can and need to do.
Right, so the ARENA project does some analysis, but it also does some experimental solution finding. I think, first of all, you mentioned Wreath. So these are the idea that we have a new information system and we need to learn how to make it work for us, work for our democracy and our society, is not an entirely new problem. And this was the problem that Britain, actually all democracies, but Britain, for example, faced with the invention of radio and eventually television in the first part of the 20th century. And there was a lot of thinking that went in. What do we do with this new medium? How do we make sure that it brings us together as a nation instead of dividing us? And the result of the conversation and the thinking about it was the creation of the BBC. And the BBC, in its original idea, was meant to reach everybody. There was people in Cornwall and people in Scotland, and it had different voices. Back then it was sort of different social classes, but also different geographies. And the idea was that it would knit Britons together in a kind of national conversation. And you'll correct me if I get this wrong, because I'm sure this is part of your work. So the question is, what is the modern equivalent of that? So if we're looking at this new, and by the way, although I sympathize with everybody's desire for institutions and expertise, I don't think we're going back to the model that we had before. And I don't think it's ever going to be the case again that somehow everybody reads the New York Times and accepts it as true. It's just not going to happen that era has ended. So what is the new model? And so the question is, how do we think about the internet broadly and social media a little bit more narrowly? How do we make it work for us? You know, are there algorithms that instead of favoring sensationalism and leading to polarization, is there a public service algorithm that would pull us together? Is there a way, I mean, and then for example, the American answer to the broadcasting dilemma was not the BBC, it was a system of licensing and regulation. Are there forms of regulation that can make the internet more civilized? By which I don't mean taking down content, which is something that Germans always want to do, but I mean, for example, curbing anonymity, increasing transparency, making it more difficult to do these false amplifications, so making it impossible to use social bots, for example. You know, are there ways, you know, could you do what the Estonians have done, for example, which is give people a kind of internet passport so that people have a real identity online, and so that at least you can choose to be part of conversations where you're talking to other real people and you're not talking to computer programs or page or trolls. So, you know, there needs to be, you know, how do we regulate the internet? Are there pieces of it that should be thought of more like public utilities? Do we want to, and who gets to decide what this is going to look like? Is it going to be Mark Zuckerberg by himself? You know, or should there be regulatory agencies involved in this? Is this really a matter that is for all of us as democracies? This is something you could think of as a conversation that should be happening at national levels, and it's beginning to actually a little bit interestingly in Britain, a little bit here, a little bit in France, not unfortunately really in the United States, but you know, it's also something you could talk about at the EU level. It's a very interesting Europe-wide conversation to have. So this is the direction I'd like to go, which is in the civilized regulation of the internet. How do we make these new technologies work for democracies and on behalf of democracy? And there are people thinking about this. There is work being done. There are some excellent papers that have been written. It's something that, you know, it's really the conversation to be had over the next several years.
Joe, was the BBC the solution, the solution that needs to be duplicated somehow today?
There was a lot of
Not exactly.
there was a lot of skepticism about the BBC, particularly in the early war years.
Sure.
In 1939, 1940, there was a great concern that information was being held back. I actually think the solution lies in us. We are part of the problem, and therefore we are also part of the answer here. First of all, I think we need to be clear as to what we have to lose. That was one of the great strengths of the propaganda campaigns in the liberal democracies in the Second World War. There was a very clear understanding of what we had to lose. What democratic functions will we lose if we go down this road? The second thing is about policing. And I'm a little bit interested in this from the work that I've done around the Second World War, because obviously during the period where Lord Haw, Nazi propaganda broadcasts were going into Britain, the government said, right, we've got to clamp down on this and we're going to enforce the civil defense regulations and we're going to prosecute anyone who spreads rumors seen to be coming from Lord Haw. It's problematic, it's undermining the war effort. There was a huge backlash to that because of the thought that this was impinging upon freedom of speech. So we have to take real care. What worked then in that scenario? Well, what worked was social sanction. The rest of the community denouncing certain kinds of activity. It's very interesting study in the last couple of days coming out of Loughborough University about social media use in Britain, talks too about the power of social sanction. I also think we need to challenge our own cognitive biases. We live in an echo chamber and we are part of reinforcing that echo chamber for ourselves. It was what we were talking about earlier. So I think some of this comes down to self-policing and a proper civic education program in our schools about critical thinking and what it means to live in the new digital age.
Just so I understand correctly, what you're suggesting, this social policing or social effort, it's essentially name and shame, right?
That's what's
within
going
the community.
on now, denouncing, calling out.
But what happens when you can't
out.
attribute? What happens when...
Sorry? I mean, that's one of the difficulties. But we need to counter some of this information with fact. And this is where we come back to the importance of expertise. In fact, we may well have moved on from that environment. I'm not saying that we're going to go back to the 1940s. We're not. But we do still have the power of research and information. And I think we need to deploy it.
So, I mean, I think Joe was suggesting, I completely agree, political correctness is a solution, which is why political correctness is attacked as a, meaning don't call immigrants snakes, don't use this. Now, you probably can't do it legally. You have to do it via social sanctions, but it's no accident. There's an interview with Orban today, where Orban just published today with Bernard-Henri Lévy. He said, liberalism is political correctness. That's what liberalism is. And he's not wrong. Liberalism is equal respect for each other. And liberal norms get attacked, and we need to, we need to deal with that. We need to reinforce our liberal norms. Now, how to do that? So there's propaganda, and then there's what Joe's been calling the underlying beliefs that it requires in order to be effective. So how do we eliminate the underlying beliefs? How do we address the underlying beliefs that make all of our countries so vulnerable to these far-right movements? Well, there are some some time-worn suggestions. We've been talking about Arendt. If you look both at Arendt and Du Bois in two very different situations, they talk about the importance of labor unions, like practical politics that brings people together and gets people away from fake identities like fictitious national identities or racial identities or gender and education. Whenever I think about an education system that teaches people about the past, like Germany's Erinnerungskultur, that's got to be a central, that sort of cliche, but Joe has been emphasizing throughout that propaganda is not some magical thing. It's the underlying ideology, and propaganda just sort of like reaches back, and so we have to address those underlying ideologies.
I just want to throw in that in September last year, you mentioned the EU, and the EU produced a code of practice on disinformation. So there's a document, there's a policy, and several platforms, Facebook, Google, Twitter, have signed on to this. So essentially, it means that they accept guidelines by which they would limit automated trolls, inauthentic accounts, etc. So we're really in the very, very early stages. Literally, this is 9 months ago. So we're in the early stages of thinking about how as an entity, the EU might be able to regulate some of this. And Marcus, you worked on a chart. I wanted you to mention this for a minute, that you worked on a charter, a European charter of fundamental rights in the digital era. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, thank you for asking that question, because I completely agree with Joe. Of course, we have to start with the man in the mirror, as Michael Jackson put it. That is true, but being a lawyer, obviously, my gut feeling, my experience is that rules establish society, and we are having now a global society, so we need global rules. Mm-hmm. And of course, we can discuss many concrete proposals, what on the regional, on the local, and the national level, and the personal level have to be done, and that is all right, and I'm sharing all of this. But you are right, because I think we need a sort of discourse about what's right and what's wrong. And a charter is important, not to have concrete regulations and law. That is important as well, to a certain extent. But it is more important to learn what is important in these days, because we are facing artificial intelligence. We are facing algorithms which are deciding things about my life. And so this is new, this is disruptive. And therefore we have to discuss the relationship between freedom and security and solidarity and justice. That is all the values which are still valued, but in a complete different world. And therefore our group that was established by the Zeit Foundation in Germany, and we discussed what are the rules needed in that digital age. And again, it is not completely or entirely new, but it is the perspective that we need to have that discourse, not on a local, personal, or national level, but on a global or minimum European level. And yeah, that group worked on such a document. It was published in 2017. I have to admit it was so far not very successful, but it doesn't matter. It was a starting point, and I know that in the United States and elsewhere, groups are working on that as well. And I hope that as soon as possible that United Nations, the Global Solutions Initiative, the EU and other international actors are focusing on that, because I think you were asking about solutions. I think that is an absolutely need to have such a document. And of course, I don't have to mention the Charter of Human Rights after the Second World War, which was, and still is very fundamental and had a great impact to national regulations, to local and regulations. And I think we need such a document and such a discourse on a global level as well.
Can I push a little bit back at you on that? Because yes, it is a global phenomenon, but you will not find, I suspect, a lot of efficient multilateralism on this. There are big powers out there, I'm thinking China, I'm thinking Russia, who have no interest whatsoever in producing some kind of global, UN charter that would help us fight disinformation and protect our liberal democracies. So,
I would
do you
say
agree
even
with
more
that?
than that. I would say even more than that. I think the Chinese have already thought about this problem. They're about 10 years ahead of us, and they are in the course of creating an internet, their own internet, which serves them and their society. And this is I won't go into the details of it. Some of you have read about it. The system of social credit, whereby you make points by doing good things. But in other words, they are going to use the internet, and they're going to use their form of social media in order to serve their state system. So the question should be, what is our alternative to that? Can we come up with something that serves and builds democracy and and serves an open society, and that we can, maybe beginning in Europe and the United States and moving eventually on. But I don't think this can be. You might be able to have this conversation at the European level, maybe at the transatlantic level. But as I said, I think
with another U.S. president, perhaps.
Maybe with a different U.S. president. But I don't think the UN is going to be the place where it will be usefully discussed, because the Chinese have already got to this and they have moved on.
Joe, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the kind of human experience. We haven't really asked why people are seeking out fake news. And one of the key trends that one sees in environments that are controlled is the unbelievable desire to seek out information, particularly information that confirms your own suspicions. People will move heaven and earth to find out that information. And I think that's really important to remember.
And that's what the algorithms are good at.
Yeah, but people will move, I think, around the infosphere to find that information. And it comes down to the question, why are people seeking out this news? And it often flares up, that trend flares up at times of crisis, where people have anxieties and they're concerned. They need to make sense of the world around them, and something that fits into one neat narrative in which they can see their own place. And we have to understand why people are doing this activity and tackle the root cause rather than tackle the effects at the other end.
There's a terrible feeling it might be human nature.
I think it might be. I think that is the issue.
So in the room, I'm going to come to the room. Oh, sorry, did you want to come in with a short
If we're supposed to be hopeful, then, it's the underlying ideologies that make people do this. And maybe the underlying ideologies, nationalism is not some... Stephen Miller said, nationalism is far older than liberalism. Well, that's just not true. And so we can do things about that.
Actually, there's another helpful, useful way to think about this whole problem, actually, which sort of incorporates what we've all said, which is, I think the other point about this problem is that it's not going to be solved by a single thing. There's not going to be, and it's not going to be either education or regulation or the UN or whatever. There will be a series of things. And another useful metaphor is think about what happened when the car was invented. The car was invented and people just drove them around and they, ran into horses and so on. And everybody at first there were no rules around the car, and then slowly people go, wait, this isn't working. We need to paint lines on the street and we need some traffic lights. And then eventually there were licenses for cars, and then eventually licenses for drivers. And then people said, well, wait, can't we re-engineer a car so that it's safer? And so people built, those, what are they called? The airbags. People built airbags. The Polish word came into my head, sorry. People built airbags.
What is the Polish
Doesn't
word?
matter. So people built airbags anyway, the point is that as the car developed and as society developed around the car, we found ways to regulate it and to make it more civilized so that fewer people died and fewer damage was done and so on. And I think that the internet and social media are now going to be like that. In other words, as they progress, we will find, different ways to change them or make them suit us if we have the foresight and the bravery in a way to try and grasp this problem for what it is and remake it so that it works for us. And it's not just something that happens and we have to just all get used to it. It is a man-made thing. We can control it.
Okay, I want to do a mini poll in the room. I mean, this is a very aware public, and then we'll take questions. I promise. 30 seconds on this. Raise your hand if you are worried that democracy in your country or where you live is under threat, serious threat, as a result of disinformation, manipulation, online. Raise your hand if you think democracy in your country where you live is under serious threat. Under serious threat, yeah. Okay, that's under serious threat on the panel. I'm going to stay neutral in this. Okay, that's a fair amount of people. Raise your hand if you believe you have never personally, ever, been the victim or fallen into the trap of disinformation. No, nobody, okay. Raise your hand if you think that in the next 3 to 5 years in Europe, because we're in Europe and we're just a few days from an election, in the next 3 to 5 years we will collectively find solutions to address this problem. We will be comfortably on the road to solutions. Who is, okay, one hand, Peter in the back, okay. There is a certain amount of optimism. We're going to take questions.
Maybe.
Okay, we're going to take questions starting here, and we'll take 5 or 6 questions because I'm running late.
Not a question as such, but does it work?
Can you say who you are?
I just can't hear myself.
Can you say
Okay.
who you are? Yeah.
So not a question, but just a comment on your question, because I think you asked us to name or to put our hands up if we thought our own countries were under threat
Yes.
From fake news or whatever you want to call it. No, I'm from Britain, but I think from the far right, absolutely there's a threat. So if I would just refine that question and do it again, if I might suggest.
Okay. But we're discussing, we're focusing on disinformation. I understand. Well, the gentleman just there, please.
Johannes Ahlefeld, political advisor to the Social Democrats in Parliament. I wonder why when we talk about the defense of the open society, there's no reference to the other train of thought in Karl Popper's thinking, let's say sophisticated falsificationists, that goes to your argument about expertise, etc. And I think those two things were, at least in his thinking, let's say integrally connected. I mean, those were two sides of the same coin.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to the, at the back and then closer to the front. Yes.
Yes, I can stand up. No problem. Thank you. Solveig Richter from the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy in Erfurt. Thank you for your ideas. It was perfect to really bring me to think about all this relationship. But I would like to critically address 2 points. And the first is let's say, the linkage between populism and right-wing movements and technology and digitalization. And here I would like to bring in my personal experience from my microcosmos where I live in. I live in an area in Dresden where Pegida is very strong. And those who went to Pegida were not those who have Facebook profiles or who are going on Facebook. Those who went to the demonstrations of Pegida were those who were like listening to usual media. They were going to the street and listening to those on the street, right? All my friends who have Facebook profiles and who were on Facebook or on the liberal side were going to the demonstrations against Pegida. So please, if you can at least address that point, that it's not necessarily those who are the populists, who were voting for the populists, who are sharing all these globalized technologies, right? So they are more critical on these technologies. The second point is the framing, very shortly, the framing of digitalization or digital technology as a threat to democracy.
As a threat to?
As a threat to democracy.
Yes.
I'm teaching at a public policy school with more than 80% of people coming from the Global South, young students coming from the Global South. For them, the new technology and internet and free access to internet is actually a way of liberty and of freedom to access information and controlling information, controlling this world of this digital world is something we in the Western countries perceive as we have to kind of regulate these things. For them, it is access to a market of knowledge or to access information which they would never be able to access if we in the Western world would control them.
Thanks. So the positive side of the technological revolution. Sylvie, did you want to come in with a question? And are there other hands over here? Okay. Let's try to keep the questions short and then we're going to go to the panel.
Yeah, Sylvie Kaufmann, I'm a journalist with Le Monde. This is a little bit of a follow-up to the previous question. How do you assess the transatlantic gap on regulation? Because when you talk, if you take this metaphor of the car, I think we all agree what a car is for, and the dangers of speed driving or whatever. It's very different on freedom of expression, and as you know very well, in America, there's the First Amendment and all this, and we have much more relaxed or positive attitude towards regulation in Europe, and I guess we could come to a consensus in some time, I don't know if it's 3 or 5 years, within the EU, but I think we would still, would you agree that we would still have a very big gap with the US? And if you look at, for instance, when we tried to regulate the right to be forgotten, how difficult it was with the US. So how do you see this obstacle?
Okay, 2, 3 more questions, very briefly, if possible. Thanks. Yep.
Can I use your pencil for a second? I just don't have anything to write. Just to remind myself of the questions.
The microphone over there, could you pass it down? Thanks. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, Marion Kramers from Democratic Society. I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit. I previously worked for the marketing technology industry in the social media, and while there's a lot going on there that's really negative, that's really badly influencing our democracies, I really want to point out none of these spaces were set up to be democratic spaces, none of these were set up to be democratic institutions. Sure. None of them have ever received a mandate from citizens or the government to take on some kind of a role within our democracy. And having had the pleasure of having Cambridge Analytica pitched to me in a room at one point a few years ago, long before the crisis, most of the methods they used were not illegal. And so what I think we really need to keep sight of, and the point was made earlier that the elites have delegitimized themselves in the Iraq war, we have. We have done the same with our blatant hypocrisy around refugees. We've done the same with the economic cuts while the bankers were running free. I think there needs to be a lot more acknowledgement for the fears that live within the citizens, within constituencies. There needs to be a lot more effort in a refined way, in a really invested way around finding out what those fears are, what the underlying narrative is, what kind of words are used, and figuring out exactly how many of them are perfectly justified and what the centrist, left-wing, right-wing alternative and vision there is. Because we're basically asking constituents to be very wary of social media while not providing any response whatsoever.
Thank you so much. Okay. Yes, please go ahead.
Hello? Yeah. Hello?
Does it work?
Yeah? Okay, so Georgy Kasyanov, Ukraine historian.
We can't hear you.
Georgy Kasyanov, I'm from Ukraine, historian. I have a question to all presenters. First, do you believe that you might be also products of propaganda? And the second question is, you believe, and I see this, that the propaganda, the fake news, manipulations, etc., that's all bad things. You propose some counteraction. You propose to combat it. I heard about dialogue, I heard about deconstruction, etc. But in this case, it might be considered as anti-propaganda. So what would be the difference in this case? Thank you.
Thank you. Have we covered one last one here? Okay. Please, let's keep it short. We've got 10 minutes.
I would ask you to address one question, the phenomenon of gated communities in our media reception. Today, the normal phenomenon of gated communities is clear. People who have the same beliefs move into the same neighborhoods, talk to neighbors, and of course then they share all the beliefs, watch the same TV channels, read the same newspaper. And then somebody who holds a different belief, of course, must be crazy, because all the people I know share the same belief I have anyway. In the old times, it was easy in printed newspaper times because most newspapers, they would have different political ideas, comments, but they would agree what would be the 3 or 4 main subjects of the day and would be the 3 or 4 main arguments pro and contra. And today, through the echo chamber, we get all the time, if I like cat pictures, I get cat pictures. If I'm a leftist, I get only leftist posts. If I'm a right, and so on. So that is my main concern today. How do we avoid this effect of gated communities in our heads?
There's still good quality content out there, but it's in bubbles. And the last question.
Thank you very much, Gergely Pröle, Budapest. Recently, we could read a very interesting interview with Mr. Birnbaum, who is a very famous political advisor, the partner of Mr. Finkelstein, who passed away a couple years ago. And he was surprisingly frank, telling how propaganda works. And these two gentlemen has really very diverse clients. Democrats in the US, they define themselves as Democrats. It's important probably. And it seems to be not just a political attempt, but very much a business model, because they can sell it. Especially in Hungary, that was their idea to put Mr. Soros on the billboards. That's probably one question, what to do with this business model. The other question, you wanted to defend political correctness, but there was a very interesting case here in Germany a couple of years ago, the Silvester Night 2015 in the German media, the coverage of that in the public media. I think that was, the journalists wanted to keep the political correctness, but it went very wrong. Was that the right way to defend political correctness or not?
There was a very interesting article by Jay Rosen that maybe some of you noticed on political correctness in the German media in particular. So a nice, rich collection of questions. I'm going to ask you to pick the one you prefer, and we'll run this down the line this way. Please go ahead, Jill.
I think the first thing to say is about the question of regulation and this issue about the democratization of knowledge and the internet's power and the power of the digital age to democratize knowledge. And I think the crucial thing, it's such a difficult thing to get right, because you've got to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And the concern is if you start to limit information environments, what we know certainly from the experience of the Second World War in Britain is that people start to have real suspicion about what information is being withheld under any kind of regulation. So real clarity on that issue is needed. Just to pick up on the second point about the value of fake news and what it could tell us, I'm involved in a project looking at rumours, and it's very, very interesting. In fact, it's overturned my life's work, because I've spent my whole life looking at public opinion, and then I realised I was looking at the wrong source altogether, because it's what information is socially sanctioned, what you can say to another person. Rumour, far more interesting, because it's at one remove. And if you look at the body of rumours generated in the Second World War, they can tell you a great deal about mentalities. And I think that is a really interesting question about what fake news can reveal about the belief systems that are underpinning our society.
Yes. Anne, would you like to,
so there was,
transatlantic?
There was a transatlantic question about the US and Europe. I do think, I actually think in the US the main obstacle to any sensible conversation about regulation is not going to be US traditions of free speech. It's going to be the influence of the social media companies, which is very powerful in Washington and will get even more powerful. And here, I think partly because in Europe they're perceived as foreign, they're American, it will be easier to think about regulating them here. And so I think that's going to be a major obstacle, and it may be that the US and Europe go slightly different ways, at least for a while. Although and I hesitate, there were also a couple of comments about censorship. When I talk about regulation, I am not talking about censorship. Right now the only important group doing censorship is Facebook itself, which takes down material, for better or for worse. And I don't want to do that. I want to think more deeply about how information is spread and how we can make it more positive. There was also a comment about is it really the right that's using social media? I have to say, statistically, the far right in Europe is absolutely using social media and is sharing more things on social media and is way, and the numbers are not even close, kind of 85% to 20%. Enormous. If you see bar charts, numbers of shares, they're way out of proportion. That doesn't mean that in every particular place, that's the case. There's some oddities. For example, in Germany, Twitter is very dominated by the AfD, but also most Germans don't use Twitter, at least not in the same numbers. And the use of Facebook is different from country to country. So these are, they change in different ways, but it's, and by the way, the far right and the far left, and more generally, people on the extremes of the political spectrum are the ones who have understood it first. So finally, there were a couple of questions about, which I think were really about the question of counter-narrative. And this I really do agree with. So in my metaphor of, the car, there is a piece of the solution that is also to do with finding better ways of communication. And to your point about finding narratives or means or ways of holding conversations that knit people together, so that we're all having the same conversation. My real fear for democracy isn't fake news. My real fear is that we're going to split up into different communities and we won't be having the same conversation anymore. And in some countries, this has already happened. Okay? In Poland, this has happened. Okay? You have this deeply divided society. Nobody's even talking about the same subjects. In the United States, to some degree, this has happened. So, how do you have democracy if people don't agree what the subjects are? And so finding ways to communicate with people, whether it's through new kinds of journalism or new forms of social media or new ways of bringing people together, this is really, really important. And there was some, I don't remember now which question was about narrative, but finding ways to speak to people, to use the new technologies to reach the people and the questions that they care about. This is also, there's going to be a whole new science around that, and I hope it will come soon.
I want to repeat the question that I think propaganda studies has to look at. How much is pre-existing beliefs and what does propaganda do with pre-existing beliefs? Propaganda is not going to work without the pre-existing beliefs. How do you move from the pre-existing structure to the effects that you see with propaganda. As far as some of the regulation questions, Kamala Harris recently proposed making Facebook a public utility, which is radical, but she said, if streets you need for commerce, if you need Facebook for commerce, why not that? And maybe, and then finally, just a point about the repeated desire to make everything neutral. Yeah, I completely agree with Anne. We need a common subject matter. But that doesn't mean that we're all split just randomly in equal ways. The truth should guide us. And we need to find democracy is based on the truth. And I don't need to see more untruths in my feed. I need to see more truths. And that's not a matter of echo chambers, and that's a matter of, the truth and truths about what's politically central.
Marcus.
3 very short remarks. First, on the echo chamber, I think the phenomenon of echo chamber is right and wrong at the same time, because on the one hand, of course, yeah, there are echo chambers, and you described that excellently. But on the other hand, we discussed as well that we all confronted with perceptions from around the world. And I have to admit, in the early 70s, when I was a child, I had no clue about the discussions in England or in China, and these days I know about it. So the echo chamber phenomenon is yeah, as I said before, it's right and wrong at the same time. Secondly, the question on the media, I work a lot with media, and I see one phenomenon that journalists are starting thinking about slowing down reporting, because slowing down seems to be, from my point of view, one solution, because it's too fast, and they need to have they have the courage to correct themselves when they were wrong. That is important, to say, all right, yeah, I was wrong. That report was wrong. That was not a fake news. It was just wrong. We did a bad job, and that is important as well. We had something here in Germany with the Spiegel, a very big thing where they reported one journalist for years, complete fake stories, but they were very transparent on that, and that was very important. But my last point, and that is my most important point, and that comes to you. Framing new technology pessimistic, that is wrong. That is completely wrong, because we need a lot of optimism, and I think there's good reasons to have optimism. From my point of view, being in a bad mood, having fears, anxious, is a precondition, a psychological precondition of populism. And it's a psychological precondition of fake news as well. And therefore, I think we can be optimistic. There are enough reasons for that. Think about Friday for Futures and all the chances you described. I was around at the Arab Spring, where all these people said that we could do the revolutions because of these new technologies. So there's a lot of optimism. But still, we need some regulations for that new world, and that is not being pessimistic. It's just that let's set up some rules for this new wonderful world, and then let's win.
Wow, we ended on the new wonderful world. That's a pretty good progress line. I want to thank the audience for the great questions, and please join me in thanking the panelists with their great thanks. Thanks.